Becoming Accessible to Power, Part 2. Saturday, August 19th, 1961. Yesterday morning, Juan and I drove to town and ate breakfast at a restaurant. He advised me not to change my eating habits too drastically. Your body is not used to power meat, he said. You'd get sick if you didn't eat your food. He himself ate heartily. When I joked about it, he simply said, "My body likes everything." Around noon, we hiked back to the water canyon. We proceeded to make ourselves noticeable to the spirit by noisy talk and by a forced silence which lasted hours. When we left the place, instead of heading back to the house, Don Juan took off in the direction of the mountains. We reached some mild slopes first, and then we climbed to the top of some high hills. There, Don Juan picked out a spot to rest in the open, unshaded area. He told me that we had to wait until dusk, and that I should conduct myself in the most natural fashion, which included asking all the questions I wanted. "I know that the spirit is out there lurking," he said in a very low voice. "Where?" "Out there in the bushes." "What kind of spirit is it?" He looked at me with a quizzical expression and retorted, "How many kinds are there?" We both laughed. I was asking questions out of nervousness. "It'll come out at dusk," he said. "We just have to wait." I remained quiet. I had run out of questions. "This is the time when we must keep on talking," he said. "The human voice attracts spirits. There's one lurking out there now. We are making ourselves available to it. So keep on talking." I experienced an idiotic sense of vacuity. I could not think of anything to say. He laughed and patted me on the back. "You're truly a pill," he said. "When you have to talk, you lose your tongue. Come on, beat your gums." He made a hilarious gesture of beating his gums together, opening and closing his mouth with great speed. "There are certain things we will talk about from now on only at places of power," he went on. "I have brought you here because this is your first trial. This is a place of power, and here we can talk only about power." "I really don't know what power is," I said. "Power is something a warrior deals with," he said. "At first, it's an incredible, far-fetched affair. It is hard to even think about. This is what's happening to you now. Then power becomes a serious matter. One may not have it, or one may not even fully realize that it exists. Yet one knows that something is there, something which was not noticeable before. Next, power is manifested as something uncontrollable that comes to oneself. It is not possible for me to say how it comes or what it really is. It is nothing, and yet it makes marvels appear before your very eyes. And finally, power is something in oneself, something that controls one's acts and yet obeys one's command." There was a short pause. Don Juan asked me if I had understood. I felt ludicrous saying I did. He seemed to have noticed my dismay and chuckled. "I'm going to teach you right here the first step to power," he said as if he were dictating a letter to me. "I'm going to teach you how to set up dreaming." He looked at me and again asked me if I knew what he meant. I did not. I was hardly following him at all. He explained that to set up dreaming meant to have a concise and pragmatic control over the general situation of a dream, comparable to the control one has over any choice in the desert, such as climbing up a hill or remaining in the shade of a water canyon. "You must start by doing something very simple," he said. "Tonight in your dreams, you must look at your hands." I laughed out loud. His tone was so factual that it was as if he were telling me to do something commonplace. "Why do you laugh?" he asked with surprise. "How can I look at my hands in my dreams?" "Very simple. Focus your eyes on them just like this. He bent his head forward and stared at his hands with his mouth open. His gesture was so comical that I had to laugh. "Seriously, how can you expect me to do that?" I asked. "The way I told you," he snapped. "You can, of course, look at whatever you goddamn please. Your toes, or your belly, or your pecker for that matter. I said your hands because that was the easiest thing for me to look at. Don't think it's a joke. Dreaming is as serious as seeing or dying or any other thing in this awesome, mysterious world. Think about it as something entertaining. Imagine all the inconceivable things you could accomplish. A man hunting for power has almost no limits in his dreaming." I asked him to give me some pointers. "There aren't any pointers," he said. "Just look at your hands." "There must be more that you could tell me," I insisted. He shook his head and squinted his eyes, staring at me in short glances. "Every one of us is different," he finally said. "What you call pointers would only be what I myself did when I was learning. We are not the same. We aren't even vaguely alike. Maybe anything you'd say would help me. It would be simpler for you just to start looking at your hands." He seemed to be organizing his thoughts and bobbed his head up and down. "Every time you look at anything in your dreams, it changes shape," he said after a long silence. "The trick in learning to set up dreaming is obviously not just to look at things, but to sustain the sight of them. Dreaming is real when one has succeeded in bringing everything into focus. Then there is no difference between what you do when you sleep and what you do when you are not sleeping. Do you see what I mean?" I confess that although I understood what he had said, I was incapable of accepting his premise. I brought up the point that in a civilized world, there were scores of people who had delusions and could not distinguish what took place in the real world from what took place in their fantasies. I said that such persons were undoubtedly mentally ill, and my uneasiness increased every time he would recommend I should act like a crazy man. After my long explanation, Don Juan made a comical gesture of despair by putting his hands to his cheeks and sighing loudly. "Leave your civilized world alone," he said. "Let it be. Nobody is asking you to behave like a madman. I've already told you, a warrior has to be perfect in order to deal with the powers he hunts. How can you conceive that a warrior would not be able to tell things apart? On the other hand, you, my friend, who know what the real world is, would fumble and die in no time at all if you would have to depend on your ability for telling what is real and what is not." I obviously had not expressed what I really had in mind. Every time I protested, I was simply voicing the unbearable frustration of being in an untenable position. "I am not trying to make you into a sick, crazy man," Don Juan went on. "You can do that yourself without my help. But the forces that guide us brought you to me, and I have been endeavoring to teach you to change your stupid ways and live the strong, clean life of a hunter. Then the forces guided you again and told me that you should learn to live the impeccable life of a warrior. Apparently you can't, but who can tell? We are as mysterious and as awesome as this unfathomable world, so who can tell what you're capable of?" There was an underlying tone of sadness in Don Juan's voice. I wanted to apologize, but he began to talk again. "You don't have to look at your hands," he said. "Like I've said, pick anything at all, but pick one thing in advance and find it in your dreams. I said your hands because they'll always be there. When they begin to change shape, you must move your sight away from them and pick something else, and then look at your hands again. It takes a long time to perfect this technique." I had become so involved in writing that I had not noticed that it was getting dark. The sun had already disappeared over the horizon. The sky was cloudy and the twilight was imminent. Don Juan stood up and gave furtive glances towards the south. "Let's go," he said. "We must walk south until the spirit of the waterhole shows itself." We walked for perhaps half an hour. The terrain changed abruptly and we came to a barren area. There was a large round hill where the chaparral had burnt. It looked like a bald head. We walked towards it. I thought that Don Juan was going to climb the mild slope, but he stopped instead and remained in a very attentive position. His body seemed to have tensed as a single unit and shivered for an instant. Then he relaxed again and stood limply. I could not figure out how his body could remain erect while his muscles were so relaxed. At that moment, a very strong gust of wind jolted me. Don Juan's body turned in the direction of the wind, towards the west. He did not use his muscles to turn, or at least he did not use them the way I would use mine to turn. Don Juan's body seemed rather to have been pulled from the outside. It was as if someone else had arranged his body to face a new direction. I kept on staring at him. He looked at me from the corner of his eye. The expression on his face was one of determination, purpose. All of his being was attentive, and I stared at him in wonder. I had never been in any situation that called for such a strange concentration. Suddenly his body shivered as though he had been splashed by a sudden shower of cold water. He had another jolt, and then he started to walk as if nothing had happened. I followed him. We flanked the naked hill on the east side until we were at the middle part of it. He stopped there, turning to face the west. From where we stood, the top of the hill was not so round and smooth as it had seemed to be from the distance. There was a cave, or a hole near the top. I looked at it fixedly because Don Juan was doing the same. Another strong gust of wind sent a chill up my spine. Don Juan turned towards the south and scanned the area with his eyes. "There," he said in a whisper and pointed to an object on the ground. I strained my eyes to see. There was something on the ground, perhaps 20 feet away. It was light brown, and as I looked at it, it shivered. I focused all my attention on it. The object was almost round and seemed to be curled. In fact, it looked like a curled-up dog. "What is it?" I whispered to Don Juan. "I don't know," he whispered back as he peered at the object. "What does it look like to you?" I told him that it seemed to be a dog. "Too large for a dog," he said matter-of-factly. I took a couple of steps towards it, but Don Juan stopped me gently. I stared at it again. It was definitely some animal that was either asleep or dead. I could almost see its head. Its ears protruded like the ears of a wolf. By then, I was definitely sure that it was a curled-up animal. I thought it could have been a brown calf. I whispered that to Don Juan. He answered that it was too compact to be a calf. Besides, its ears were pointed. The animal shivered again, and then I noticed that it was alive. I could actually see that it was breathing, yet it did not seem to breathe rhythmically. The breaths that it took were more like irregular shivers. I had a sudden realization at that moment. "It's an animal that is dying," I whispered to Don Juan. "You're right," he whispered back. "But what kind of animal?" I could not make out its specific features. Don Juan took a couple of cautious steps towards it. I followed him. It was quite dark by then, and we had to take 2 more steps in order to keep the animal in view. "Watch out," Don Juan whispered in my ear. "If it is a dying animal, it may leap on us with its last strength." The animal, whatever it was, seemed to be on its last legs. Its breathing was irregular. Its body shook spasmodically, but it did not change its curled-up position. At a given moment, however, a tremendous spasm actually lifted the animal off the ground. I heard an inhuman shriek, and the animal stretched its legs. Its claws were more than frightening. They were nauseating. The animal tumbled on its side after stretching its legs and then rolled on its back. I heard a formidable growl and Don Juan's voice shouting, "Run for your life!" And that is exactly what I did. I scrambled towards the top of the hill with unbelievable speed and agility. When I was halfway to the top, I looked back and saw Don Juan standing in the same place. He signaled me to come down. I ran down the hill. "What happened?" I asked, completely out of breath. "I think the animal is dead," he said. We advanced cautiously towards the animal. It was sprawled on its back. As I came closer to it, I nearly yelled with fright. I realized that it was not quite dead yet. Its body was still trembling. Its legs, which were sticking up in the air, shook wildly. The animal was definitely in its last gasps. I walked in front of Don Juan. A new jolt moved the animal's body, and I could see its head. I turned to Don Juan horrified. Judging by its body, the animal was obviously a mammal, yet it had a beak like a bird. I stared at it in complete and absolute horror. My mind refused to believe it. I was dumbfounded. I could not even articulate a word. Never in my whole existence had I witnessed anything of that nature. Something inconceivable was there in front of my very eyes. I wanted Don Juan to explain the incredible animal, but I could only mumble to him. He was staring at me. I glanced at him and glanced at the animal, and then something in me arranged the world, and I knew at once what the animal was. I walked over to pick it up. It was a large branch of a bush. It had been burnt, and possibly the wind had blown some burnt debris which got caught up in the dry branch and thus gave the appearance of a large, bulging, round animal. The color of the burnt debris made it look light brown in contrast with the green vegetation. I laughed at my idiocy and excitedly explained to Don Juan that the wind blowing through it had made it look like a live animal. I thought he would be pleased with the way I had resolved the mystery, but he turned around and began walking to the top of the hill. I followed him. He crawled inside the depression that looked like a cave. It was not a hole, but a shallow dent in the sandstone. Don Juan took some small branches and used them to scoop up the dirt that had accumulated in the bottom of the depression. "We have to get rid of the ticks," he said. He signaled me to sit down and told me to make myself comfortable because we were going to spend the night there. I began to talk about the branch, but he hushed me up. "What you've done is no triumph," he said. "You've wasted a beautiful power that blew life into that dry twig." He said that a real triumph would have been for me to let go and follow the power until the world had ceased to exist. He did not seem to be angry with me or disappointed with my performance. He repeatedly stated that this was only the beginning, that it took time to handle power. He patted me on the shoulder and joked that earlier that day I was the person who knew what was real and what was not. I felt embarrassed. I began to apologize for my tendency of always being so sure of my ways. "It doesn't matter," he said. "That branch was a real animal, and it was alive at the moment the power touched it. Since what kept it alive was power, the trick was, like in dreaming, to sustain the sight of it. See what I mean?" I wanted to ask something else, but he hushed me up and said that I should remain completely silent but awake all night, and that he alone was going to talk for a while. He said that the spirit which knew his voice might become subdued with the sound of it and leave us alone. He explained that the idea of making oneself accessible to power had serious overtones. Power was a devastating force that could easily lead to one's death and had to be treated with great care. Becoming available to power had to be done systematically, but always with great caution. It involved making one's presence obvious by a contained display of loud talk or any other type of noisy activity, and then it was mandatory to observe a prolonged and total silence. A controlled outburst and a controlled quietness were the mark of a warrior. He said that properly I should have sustained the sight of the live monster for a while longer, in a controlled fashion without losing my mind or becoming deranged with excitation or fear. I should have striven to stop the world. He pointed out that after I had run up the hill for dear life, I was in a perfect state for stopping the world. Combined in that state were fear, awe, power, and death. He said that such a state would be pretty hard to repeat. I whispered in his ear, "What do you mean by stopping the world?" He gave me a ferocious look before he answered that it was a technique practiced by those who were hunting for power, a technique by virtue of which the world as we know it was made to collapse. Once again, Coach Brian with Northwest Elite Spirit, and this has been Becoming Accessible to Power, Part 2 from Journey to Ixtlan by Carlos Castaneda. For access to my suggested library, my blog, Northwest Elite Spirit merchandise, and to be personally trained by me online, go to northwestelitespirit.com. If you haven't subscribed yet, do that now. Like, comment, share, and of course, practice. Thank you.